Dawn broke over the shattered hills of Hürtgen Forest on November 25, 1944. The mist clung to the treetops like a living thing, curling through the blackened trunks and broken helmets that littered the ground. Somewhere below that grey canopy, the 12th Infantry Regiment was dying. Machine gun fire stitched the mud. Mortar shells fell in irregular rhythm, shaking the frozen soil with each concussive thud. In a shallow foxhole near the tree line, a lone medic named Corporal Thomas H. Bennett pressed his back against the dirt wall, his breath clouding in the cold air, clutching a battered aid kit that was nearly empty. U.S. Army Combat Camera Archive, Nov. 1944. The radio was dead. The forward line had collapsed. Men screamed for help through the fog, their voices thin and unreal. Bennett had already crawled through machine gun fire 3 times since sunrise, dragging the wounded back by their webbing straps. His hands were slick with blood, his jacket torn by shrapnel. The battalion command post had been wiped out by a direct hit an hour earlier. The Germans, somewhere beyond the timber line, were closing in fast, confident, methodical, precise. This was supposed to be a push, another brutal step toward the Rhine. But now, surrounded on 3 sides and cut off from supply lines, the remnants of the 12th were facing annihilation. Of the original 600 who'd entered the forest that week, less than 200 still held rifles. U.S. Army After Action Report, Dec. 1944. The air was thick with cordite and pine smoke. Bennett peeked over the lip of the trench and saw movement. A squad of Germans, maybe 20 men, advancing through the underbrush with MP-40s raised. A wounded sergeant nearby whispered, "They're flanking us." Bennett knew what that meant. The line was finished. But something inside him, the reflex of training, maybe madness, told him to move. He tore open his last syringe of morphine, jammed it into the sergeant's arm and whispered, "Hold on." Then he slung his medic's bag over his shoulder and crawled into the open. Bullets snapped past, chewing bark and mud. One ricochet clipped his helmet. Another hit the ground inches from his hand. He kept crawling. Every nerve screamed to stay down, but he didn't stop. Ahead lay a cluster of wounded men, 4, maybe 5, lying exposed between the lines. He reached the first, pressed a compress against the man's chest, and dragged him by his collar toward the nearest stump. Then another. Then another. U.S. Army Field Log, 26th Infantry Division, Nov. 1944. No one could see it from above, but what Bennett did next defied battlefield logic. Instead of pulling back toward friendly lines, he moved deeper toward enemy positions, into the kill zone. The wounded were scattered across a low clearing that the Germans were raking with machine gun bursts. By crawling forward instead of backward, Bennett drew their fire away from the survivors trying to regroup behind him. His movement, that single self-imposed decoy, forced the Germans to pivot their barrels, buying his battalion precious minutes to form a defensive perimeter. Bundesarchiv 344th Volksgrenadier Division report. The forest echoed with the groan of engines, German half-tracks grinding up the slope. The medic reached one last man, a young private with both legs shattered. Bennett whispered something to him, no one ever knew what, before throwing himself across the soldier's body as another mortar shell hit nearby. When the smoke cleared, Bennett's helmet was gone, his uniform torn open. He was still breathing, but barely. The private would live. The medic somehow kept going. By mid-afternoon, radio intercepts from Division HQ painted a desperate picture. Reinforcements were hours away. Artillery support had been redirected south. The 12th was now officially listed as cut-off. The German advance was expected to overrun the sector by nightfall. 5th Corps Situation Report, Nov. 25, 1944. And yet in those final hours before dusk, something changed. The German commander, Oberst Wilhelm Krüger, hesitated. His units reported unusual resistance, describing medics carrying rifles and enemy casualties being moved through our fire zones. Bundesarchiv. Kriegstagebuch 1944. Confusion spread. The Americans, it seemed, weren't retreating. They were reforming, establishing a line that should have been impossible to hold. The medic, by now delirious from blood loss, had become the center of that defense. Men followed his movements like signals. When he crawled left, they shifted with him. When he stood, staggering and half-blind, they rose behind him. By the time dusk fell, the German offensive had stalled. Reinforcements arrived under cover of darkness, guided by the last flicker of a signal flare fired from Bennett's position. When they found him, he was unconscious, surrounded by the men he had dragged from the clearing. Of the 43 survivors in that company, 31 owed their lives to one medic's defiance of orders. U.S. Army Casualty Evacuation Log, Dec 1944. But the story of Thomas Bennett and the crazy decision that saved his battalion didn't end there. Because what happened in Hürtgen wasn't just a moment of courage. It was an act that exposed something the U.S. Army hadn't fully understood about its own war machine. Behind every tank, every gun, every radio frequency, there existed another kind of lifeline, a human one, that no logistics plan could quantify. The medics, engineers, stretcher-bearers, and surgeons became the invisible network sustaining the Allied advance. U.S. Medical Corps Operational Study, 945. The Germans had their own field medics, brave and efficient, but by late 1944 they were exhausted, under-equipped and demoralized. The Allies, by contrast, had begun deploying mobile surgical units, frontline plasma systems and field radios linking aid stations directly to artillery command. The result, faster casualty evacuation, higher morale and sustained combat efficiency. It was warfare transformed not by new weapons, but by new ways of saving life amid destruction. British War Office Technical Memo, Jan 1945. For the men trapped in that forest, those systems didn't exist on paper. They existed in the trembling hands of one man with a red cross on his sleeve. Every time Bennett crawled forward, every life he dragged back, he carried more than a wounded soldier. He carried a piece of the battalion's will to fight. As he was lifted onto a stretcher under the fading orange light, a sergeant radioed to HQ. "The medic's alive." He held them off. The voice crackled, almost disbelief. That message, relayed up the chain, became one of countless small transmissions that shaped the greater narrative of the Western Front. The power of a single decision, made in chaos to alter the fate of hundreds. What no one yet realized was that this incident would trigger an internal Army investigation into battlefield medical coordination, one that would uncover something astonishing about how the U.S. fought, moved, and survived across Europe. U.S. Army Medical Department Circular, Jan 1945. And in the heart of that discovery lay the shocking truth behind Bennett's crazy decision, a truth that would change the way armies thought about courage, command, and the anatomy of survival itself. When the reports from Hurtgen reached the U.S. First Army headquarters in Spa, Belgium, they were met with disbelief. A single medic, armed only with gauze, morphine, and nerve, had delayed a German assault long enough to save his battalion. Major General Clarence Hübner ordered an immediate inquiry, not to question Bennett's actions, but to understand how one man without a weapon had managed to alter a battle's outcome. First Army Staff Report, Dec 1944. The investigation's findings would expose a quiet revolution underway in the Allied war effort, a hidden advantage that had little to do with guns or tanks, and everything to do with communication. By late 1944, the U.S. Medical Corps had begun experimenting with portable short-range radios linked directly to battalion command nets. These were not the standard SCR-300 walkie-talkies issued to infantry squads. They were smaller, custom-built variants modified by Signal Corps technicians to operate on medical channels, coded under the VHF Lifeline program. Technical Manual TM 11242, 1944. Bennett, it turned out, had been one of the first medics trained to use them. During the chaos at Hürtgen, his radio was hit by shrapnel and went silent. But before it failed, it had already transmitted a single burst signal, a distress code, picked up by a mobile aid station several miles away. That pulse allowed artillery observers to triangulate his position and redirect fire support, unknowingly shielding the survivors he would later save. Signal Corps Operational Record, Nov 1944. Behind that innovation was a small team of engineers working out of Fort Monmouth, New Jersey. Led by Lieutenant Colonel Raymond D. Mettler, they'd been experimenting since 1942 with medical field communication systems capable of operating through heavy interference, fog, shell bursts, terrain distortion. Their work had been classified, dismissed by some as a distraction from real combat tech. But Hürtgen changed everything. U.S. Signal Corps Engineering Memo, DEC 1944. The VHF lifeline used frequencies between 144 to 174 MHz, with effective range up to 2.5 miles in dense forest. Its key feature was modularity, a collapsible antenna, a waterproof chassis, and simplified controls designed for men under fire. Weighing under 15 pounds, it allowed medics to communicate directly with both frontline and rear echelons, bypassing traditional relay chains. Bureau of Communications Engineering Report 1944. When Bennett's distress signal reached Division HQ, an automatic log entry was created, time-stamped, location-coded. That record later helped reconstruct how his actions influenced battlefield coordination. It revealed that within minutes of his message, artillery observers adjusted fire 300 yards east, unintentionally suppressing the German advance. Bennett's crawl into the clearing hadn't just been heroism. It had been guided by a faint thread of technology, connecting life and death. U.S. Field Signal Analysis, Jan 1945. The Germans, meanwhile, had no such system. Their medical units relied on runners and pre-designated triage posts. Once communication lines were cut, as they often were in forest terrain, casualties went unreported, leading to chaos and collapse in field morale. Dramatized composite. A captured German sergeant later described it. Our wounded screamed for hours. We could hear them, but we could not reach them. The Americans, they called for help, and it came. Interrogation transcript. 344th Volksgrenadier Division, 1945. This disparity in communication had strategic consequences far beyond Hürtgen. By December 1944, across the Western Front, U.S. forces were operating with what historians would later call medical command integration. It meant that every combat unit, infantry, armor, artillery, had a direct lifeline to medical evacuation and supply. The result was faster triage, better survival rates, and an unexpected psychological weapon. Soldiers knew they would be rescued. U.S. Army Medical Department Study 1945. To understand how radical this was, one must look at the design itself. The SCR 511, prototype predecessor to Bennett's set, was built by engineers at the Galvin Manufacturing Corporation, later known as Motorola. It used a regenerative receiver, with miniature vacuum tubes coated for moisture resistance. The battery pack, a compact 103-volt dry cell, could operate for 24 hours under field conditions. Motorola Engineering Note 1943. In contrast, German field medics carried minimal equipment, a stretcher, morphine ampules, and a whistle. Communication between battalions depended on field telephones vulnerable to shelling. Their signals, often wired through exposed cables, were easily severed. OKW Medical Service Report 1944. Hurtgen became the proof of concept that saved lives by the thousands in later campaigns. The Bulge, the Rhine crossings, and finally the Ruhr. The lifeline network was rapidly expanded, integrated with jeep-mounted transmitters, and even tested aboard amphibious DUKWs for river crossings. U.S. Signal Corps Development Brief, Feb 1945. At the tactical level, it changed combat behavior. Medics, once passive responders, became active battlefield navigators, directing litter teams marking safe zones, even relaying artillery corrections through their channels. The enemy began to notice. Dramatized composite. Their medics move like scouts, wrote one German lieutenant in his diary. They crawl where others fall. It makes the wounded rise again. Bundesarchiv Personal Papers 1945. To the U.S. command, this was more than technology. It was doctrine. General Omar Bradley authorized Operation Field Angel, logistical directive ensuring every battalion received a dedicated medical communication set by spring 1945. The project drew on engineers from Western Electric, General Electric, and Bell Labs, all working under compressed schedules. Production reached 4,000 units per month by February. Office of War Production Report 1945. And behind each of those radios stood a philosophy, one born of horror and necessity. The Medical Corps realized that saving a man under fire wasn't only compassion, it was economy. Every life saved meant one more rifle, one more heartbeat sustaining the front. The engineers understood this too. Mettler's team often worked 18-hour shifts, testing circuits inside cold hangars, using captured German jamming equipment to simulate interference. Signal Corps Oral History, 1947. Meanwhile, in the field hospitals behind the front, surgeons like Major Charles Drew, a pioneer of plasma preservation, were revolutionizing how wounded soldiers survived long enough to see another dawn. Drew's methods for separating and storing plasma were implemented across Europe in early 1945, transforming evacuation chains into mobile systems that followed the advance itself. U.S. Army Blood Transfusion Service Report, 1945. And so, the crazy decision of one medic in a forest was no isolated act. It was a human expression of a larger, invisible web of science and courage, connecting engineers in New Jersey to stretcher-bearers in Belgium. The battlefield was no longer just guns and ground. It was circuits and signals, heartbeat to heartbeat. The decisive test of that system came weeks later, during the Battle of the Bulge. In the freezing night of December 19, 1944, near Bastogne, a forward aid post of the 101st Airborne was cut off. Shells fell in relentless rhythm. The wounded piled up. A medic named Frank Doss, carrying the new field set derived from Bennett's model, crawled through the snow to an open field, raised his antenna and sent the code LZ-Red. Within minutes, C-47 transports dropped supplies guided by that signal. An impossible rescue, born from a dead man's radio. Airborne Operations Log, Deck 1944. The engineers never met the medics who used their devices, and the medics never knew the men behind the circuits. Yet both fought the same war, one in mud, one in voltage. Their partnership embodied the unseen heart of modern warfare, that the difference between annihilation and survival could be measured not just in courage, but in frequencies. Still, as 1945 began, the Army faced a sobering realization. The communication lifeline that saved thousands also revealed a new vulnerability: dependence on fragile battery-powered links that could fail at any moment. In the chaos of retreat or siege, even the best system could go silent. And somewhere in that silence, the story of Thomas Bennett wasn't finished. Because hidden in his final transmission, logs lay a coded detail that would baffle investigators, a technical mystery suggesting that his radio should never have worked at all. The decoded transmission from Corporal Bennett shattered. Radio arrived at the Signal Corps analysis station outside Liège in January 1945. What technicians found stunned them. The broadcast shouldn't have existed. The VHF channel Bennett used, 163.1 atmos, required a stable power cell and full antenna assembly to transmit beyond 300 yards. His unit, recovered at Hurtgen, was missing both. Yet the signal had reached nearly 2 miles through forest and artillery interference. Signal Corps Technical Investigation, Jan 1945. The engineers traced the anomaly to a rare atmospheric condition, a ducting phenomenon, where cold and warm air layers trapped the signal and carried it farther than any field test predicted. But that wasn't the full answer. On closer inspection, they noticed Bennett's radio had been jury-rigged. A piece of copper wire, stripped from a shell casing, was soldered crudely between the antenna post and the power jack. It was a field modification, improvised under fire. U.S. Army Communications Log, Jan 1945. That single repair, reckless, desperate, crazy, became the defining symbol of wartime innovation. Bennett had unknowingly created an improvised resonant loop that stabilized the output frequency, allowing the damaged set to function just long enough for his signal to be heard. The act of a dying medic, grasping at survival, had produced an engineering miracle. U.S. Army Technical Report, 11 to 4/15, 1945. When General Hübner received the findings, he ordered a full doctrinal review. Out of that came the Bennett Field Adaptation Protocol, a simple directive circulated to every U.S. division. If standard procedure fails, improvise. If equipment breaks, adapt. Every life saved is worth the risk. First Army Circular, Feb 1945. That message spread faster than any technology. It validated the spirit that defined Allied warfare, the relentless, inventive humanity of soldiers and engineers alike. Across France and Belgium, mechanics rewired radios using cigarette foil, tank crews patched fuel lines with chewing gum, medics sterilized scalpels over engine heat. The system itself, the vast machinery of war, began to learn from its own front-line improvisations. U.S. Ordnance Maintenance Memo 1945. The impact rippled upward. The Surgeon General's office commissioned a study on adaptive survival, concluding that morale improved when soldiers believed innovation could save them. Medical Department Psychological Bulletin, to 1945. The report cited Bennett's case repeatedly. In circumstances of hopelessness, creative defiance sustains cohesion. As the Allies crossed the Rhine in March 1945, the lessons of Hurtgen were embedded in every medical and logistical plan. Field hospitals moved closer to the front. New relay aircraft, known as flying switchboards, maintained continuous radio contact between divisions and surgical units. Each medic carried an updated SCR-511B set, smaller and more durable, its antenna designed directly from Bennett's improvised wiring. Bureau of Ships and Signal Development Report, MAR 1945. But the advantage wasn't only mechanical, it was psychological. The Wehrmacht's medical chain had collapsed under Allied air dominance, their evacuation routes shredded. German soldiers increasingly surrendered, rather than risk bleeding out unseen. Dramatized composite. "The Americans will find you," one captured officer told his men. "Ours will not." Post-war interrogation record 1946. That morale imbalance, multiplied by thousands of small moments like Bennett's, changed the rhythm of the Western Front. Every wounded soldier who lived returned to the fight with a story, proof that the system worked, that the army cared. This trust became a weapon. Analysts later calculated that the presence of a medic within 50 yards increased infantry endurance by up to 40% during sustained combat. U.S. Army Morale and Cohesion Study 1947, yet the human cost remained staggering. By VE Day, the U.S. Medical Corps had treated over 2.3 million wounded in the European theater. Nearly 15,000 medics were killed or captured in the line of duty. They worked under fire without weapons, carrying bandages instead of bullets. U.S. Army Medical Department Final Report 1945. Bennett never recovered from his wounds. He died weeks later at a field hospital near Luxembourg. His name faded quietly into the archives, one among many. But his decision, that impossible act in a dying forest, lived on in the circuitry of every battlefield radio built thereafter. After the war, engineers at Bell Labs studied the Bennett effect, incorporating it into early field transceivers used in Korea and Vietnam. His improvised copper loop became standard in ruggedized radio design. The lessons from the Medical Corps inspired modern combat lifesaver programs and digital telemetry systems that today link soldiers directly to trauma surgeons via encrypted channels. Department of Defense Systems Evolution Report 1988. But perhaps the most profound impact was philosophical. The war's industrial logic, production, tonnage, logistics, had often drowned the human pulse beneath statistics. Bennett's story inverted that. It reminded commanders and scientists alike that the smallest human act could alter the largest machine. His radio, patched with a fragment of brass, symbolized the fusion of flesh and metal that defined 20th century warfare. Post-war psychological studies drew from his case to understand why men risked everything under impossible odds. Dr. Charles Watkins, writing for the Veterans Administration in 1947, noted, "Courage in combat is rarely blind. It is guided by connection, the belief that one's action matters to another life." VA Psychological Survey. 1947, that connection carried by frequencies once thought impossible, became the quiet spine of post-war military doctrine. From NATO's integrated communications to the U.S. Army's future network-centric operations, every command and control philosophy echoed the same truth discovered in that frozen forest. Speed, signal, and compassion were now the pillars of modern warfare. Even decades later, as satellites replaced field radios and drones replaced scouts, Bennett's legacy lingered in the core ethos of combat medicine, that technology is meaningless without the will to use it for life. During Operation Desert Storm, medics carried digital transmitters named Lifeline modules, their technical lineage traced back to 1944 to a single copper wire twisted in desperation. U.S. Army Signal Modernization Overview, 1991. In a declassified 1993 interview, retired engineer Raymond Mettler, the man who led the original Fort Monmouth team, reflected, "We didn't invent heroism. We just built tools for it. Bennett taught us that machines mean nothing until someone is willing to crawl through hell to make them matter." Oral History Collection, Signal Corps Museum. In the end, history did not record Bennett's last words. Witnesses said he smiled faintly as medics lifted him into the ambulance, whispering something no one could hear over the roar of engines. Dramatized. Some claimed he said, "Tell them it worked." Others swore he said nothing at all, but his silence spoke louder than any citation. In that quiet lay the essence of what defined the Allied victory. The fusion of courage and ingenuity, of blood and wire, of human will transcending the machinery of destruction. The Hürtgen Forest, long after the war, grew back its trees. The mud hardened, the trenches vanished, and nature reclaimed the wounds. Yet beneath the soil still lie fragments of metal, rusted radios, twisted helmets, scraps of copper. Each one a relic of that strange, miraculous moment when one medic's crazy decision became a signal strong enough to reach through history itself. In modern war, as one post-war general would write, "Connection outweighs firepower, and speed defeats armor." U.S. Strategic Lessons Memorandum, 1946. And somewhere in that silent frequency between courage and chaos, Corporal Thomas Bennett's voice still lingers, a reminder that sometimes the greatest weapon on the battlefield isn't designed to kill, but to keep hope alive.